He came to the mountain as a man who had known both palace stone and desert dust, whose hands had learned to straighten a reed-bent staff as readily as they had smoothed a child's tunic. The sun lay heavy on his shoulders. The wind carried the resinous scent of shrubs and the faint salt of distant seas. Moses stood among the flints and junipers of Horeb, watching his flock move like a slow river over the hill, when a flame clung to a thorn bush and did not consume it. He had seen fires that ate bread and fires that burnt fields. This one held its brightness and kept its shape, as if a small and merciful furnace had been shut in the wound of the world to give a single light for a single man. If you will stay with this telling until the end, you will find in Moses not only the great deliverer, but a soul of trembling faith, one called by a voice that cuts through every excuse. If this story speaks to you, linger, subscribe, and share this word. There are more stories of broken hearts and steadfast faith yet to be told. He drew near, barefooted, as the voice said, "Come no nearer. Remove thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." The command came not as a rebuke, but as a framing, holding the moment like a clay jar to be opened with reverence. Moses felt the old contradictions within him, his manhood formed in the house of Pharaoh, his conscience made to ache by the sight of Hebrew bondsmen. He had fled once, a man afraid of his own rage. Now he heard his name called by one who knew the shape of his doubts. "Who am I?" he answered, with the humility of one unready to bear the burden of another's liberty. He touched the bark of the thorn, and the heat that should have consumed did not harm him. A hand reached into the hollow of his chest and placed words there, "I will be with thee." The promise sank like rain into dry soil. It was not a promise of swelling armies or swift help, it was a company. The voice unfolded what must be done, naming the river of suffering and the house of bondage, the groan beneath bricks and the cry of mothers. "Let my people go." Moses' heart was a reluctant reed. He spoke of his speech, of his slowness, of the churls of memory that called him the Egyptian. The voice did not excuse. It gave signs. The staff would become a serpent, and then a staff again. His hand, leprous and whole. Water poured on sand would turn blood upon the earth. Yet, even with these wonders, his resistance was gentle and stubborn. He feared the men of the court, the iron of Pharaoh's will, and the poor readiness of his own tongue. When he returned to Egypt, his sleeves still smelled of desert thyme. He found his brother Aaron, who waited like one who had already chosen to be a sure hand for another's weakness. Aaron's greeting was not a show, but a recognition. The man who had been away returned with a charge. Together they went before Pharaoh, bearing the simplicity of a shepherd and the earnestness of one called. Pharaoh's house was a wide mouth of stone and gold. His speech was flint. He would not loose his hold on the people. Each demand from Moses was answered with harder bondage. Each step toward mercy met by a counterweight of cruelty. The signs were given, and the land became a place of contraries. Reeds withered, frogs filled the courtyards and the pots, blood ran where clean water had been. Locusts came in a black wind, and night that could be felt fell on those who slept in the light of their own security. Yet Pharaoh's heart was stubborn, and his heart was hardened by pride and counsel. The land itself seemed to groan under the contest of wills. Each plague was a sermon and a summons, and the people watched, some with hope, many with a grievous suspicion that God might be yet another power that comes and is broken. Moses did not delight in signs. He was a man who tasted the salt of tears. In the quiet between the cries and the court, he remembered the slave quarters where a woman smoothed a child's hair with hands made callous by labor. And he remembered the moment when the anger that rose in him had seemed justice, and yet justice performed by his hand had sent him into exile. He went to the house of Midian to hide from himself, and there found a steward of a well and a daughter, Zipporah, who washed the dust from his feet and set his heart to learning the small mercies of home. In those years he bent his back in the shade and learned the patient art of tending. The flame on Horeb found within him a man weathered by both grief and humility. There were nights when Moses prayed with a voice that trembled like a reed. "Lord," said he in one such prayer, "I am numbered among those who have been taken away from their father's home. Give me the tongue to speak as justice requires, not as anger." He did not ask to be great, he asked to be faithful. Sometimes the sky seemed to answer with a single star. Sometimes the answer was silence that felt like a test. Yet the promise, "Behold, I have made thee," held him like an earthen vessel that would not break. The journey back to Egypt was not merely a march. It was a passage through memory. He saw the wetted faces of overseers who read men like ledgers, the thin smoke of pyres where a child had been lost to fever and no physician came, the shops where the pots of the poor were small and the crumbs saved as if they were commandments. Aaron stood by him, patient and practical, while the elders of Israel came to them with a hunger both for bread and for a reason to hope. Moses related the words that had been placed in his mouth, and while some trembled, others hardened. There are many who prefer the shackles they know to the unknown of a road. Pharaoh's response sharpened. Pride is a kiln that bakes cruelty into stone. He would not let go. The contest grew until the last night came, when the darkness of Egypt was a night of laments. Moses bore his hand forward, and the word passed over the houses that bore the sign. The people kept watch with blood on their lintels, and an order came like a wind. "Up, get you forth from among my people." There was haste, the unmaking of long residence in a single night. Loaves unleavened, children pressed to the breast, flocks taken as though leaving in an absence no longer measured by calendars, but by the speed of a fleeing heart. They moved as a great moving of furniture might be moved, some with joy, many with the burden of having known bondage for generations. The road out of the land tasted of the sea and of sand and of a peril that had not yet found its shape. At first there was an elation, a fierce, brief hope that split the air like a struck bell. But the breath of Olympus is brief. Men can sing at dawn and shudder by moon. Pharaoh rose up in his chariots, and the iron bit of his will broke into pursuit. The people stood at the edge of the sea, their backs to the waves, and their faces set toward the smoke and ruin of the land they had left. Moses raised his staff, a simple rod that had been made to move sheep and now was to move waters and nations. The wind carried the cry of horses and the pounding of wheels. The camp was a forest of fear and faith braided together. There, on the shore, Moses felt the old burning again, not in a bush this time, but in the bones of the people he led. He had seen God in the hush of Horeb. Now he saw him in the courage of the small and the terror of the great. He stretched out his hand over the sea at the word of the Lord, and the array of waters stood back like a held breath. Between the walls of water the ground was dry, and the people went through as one new thing. Yet at the rear, where the choices of rulers resolve into consequences, Pharaoh and his host entered. The sea closed upon them as if a hand had taken a sheet and let it fall. The morning that followed was not triumph without its cost. Those who crossed tasted salt and relief and fear at once. The women sang, and some held their dead, and some wept without naming the cause. Moses himself felt the weight of a leadership that was not a crown but a wound. He had been chosen by a flame that did not burn him, and in that choice lay an obligation heavier than a scepter, to guide a people who were both grateful and prone to forget. In the days that followed, at the edge of desert camps, where tents rose like pale moons in the sand, questions multiplied as grass in a field.
When the people found themselves hungry, they murmured for bread. When they thirsted, they accused the wilderness of being treacherous. Moses learned the hard lesson that the road of deliverance is attended by the thorns of complaint. He led them to Horeb once more, where the dust seemed to remember the first speech of a fire, and there the law was given, stones that would be set like bones to frame a nation.
The voice spoke from the cloud and the fire. The mountain trembled. The people promised, and the people trembled. Yet the making of a covenant is not merely a giving of statutes, it is the binding of a heart. Even as the law came down, the people fashioned a thing of gold to be a god in their midst. They, who had seen signs and waters parted, fell into the old craft of making gods that could be held and sold. Moses' sorrow was as a river uncontained. He stood and cast down the tablets. They broke like pottery, and the sound was a lament in the ear of God and man. He went again to plead, to intercede, and there was in him that fierce compassion which cries out for mercy and yet will not smooth sin under a smile. In the nights when the tents were still and the stars like pins in a dark cloak, Moses would speak to the Lord with a voice that was half accusation and half pleading. Why, O Lord, should thy people be made a scoff? He bade the Almighty to remember the promise to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He wore the mantle of mediator, and bore the people's iniquities like a burden upon his shoulders. The Lord answered in ways that were sometimes in thunder, sometimes in stillness, and always with the tether of a covenant designed to hold a wayward flock. There are moments in his story when the man chosen by a burning thing becomes mysterious even to himself. He sat upon the mountain and asked to see the glory of the Lord. The Lord said, "Thou canst not see my face and live." Yet he set Moses into the cleft of the rock, and he passed by, and the back of Moses tasted the fading of a presence so great that words stumbled. That fading, that glimpse, shaped the man into an earthen vessel that would hold not the fullness of God, but an impression of him, and it was enough, and it was grievous. As they journeyed toward the borders of a land whose wheaten hills awaited their little tents, the people were trained in a discipline of trust that often failed. Leaders rose and fell. Counsel was given and mislaid. Moses bore with the hardness of hearts, and at times struck the rock in anger. And the water sprang forth, but the act cost him the right to enter the land he had seen in visions. That grief, bitter, private, irrevocable, settled upon him like night. He climbed the mount to look upon the promised fields from afar, and did not cross. In his final days he gathered the tribes. The voice that had once spoken from a flame now murmured in fatherly tones. He exhorted them to remember the covenant, to choose life that their children might live. He spoke of commandments and statutes, of the mercy that walks with judgment, of a God who binds himself to a people by promise and by sacrifice. His face, said some, shone with the light of one who had met God and had not been consumed. He died upon a hill and was buried by the hand of God where no hand could find the place. The people mourned, and the story passed into the cadence of their memory.
What is the mystery of the man chosen by fire? It is not merely that he saw a bush that burned without burning. It is that he who was chosen bore in himself the contraries of fortune: palace and pasture, wrath and intercession, silent despair and steadfast obedience. He held in one hand the staff that led a nation, and in the other a grief that never left him. He teaches that calling may come wrapped in signs, and yet demand from us a willingness to be made small, that being chosen is often the slow wearing away of self until only obedience remains. If this account has stirred you, consider this small charge. Learn to listen where God is most near, often in the hush of ordinary tasks, in the tending of flocks and the waiting by a well. Practice the hard mercy of intercession for others. Carry their burdens, because in carrying them you learn the measure of God's own compassion. Now, before we go on to the later scenes of Israel's wandering and the covenants unfolding in law and testing, pause and let this image remain. The man who stood unburned in flame, whose life was a mystery of fire and flesh. In the next telling, we will follow the people through their trials in the wilderness, the making of statutes, and the final farewell of their leader. There are voices of complaint and of faith yet to be heard, and a covenant whose edges will be tested by hunger and by fear. And it came to pass that the journeys of the host were marked by a rhythm of want and wonder, by nights of complaint and mornings of provision. Hunger first taught them how slender faith could be. In the cool hours before the sun climbed, a thin cry rose among the tents. Would that we had flesh to eat! We remember the fish which we ate in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons, the leeks and the onions. The voice of longing made small the memory of the signs they had seen. The Lord heard their murmurings, and the smell of their unrestrained desire reached even the place where the cloud rested. Then the bread of heaven fell. At dawn there lay upon the ground a fine thing, a flaky bread as frost on the camp, white and small like the seed of coriander, which the people called by a name that bore the echo of their craving. They gathered it with hands still half asleep. It tasted like wafers baked with honey. The rule was given plainly: every man gather for his household an omer for each, no more, no less. Take up for 6 days and rest on the 7th. Some, driven by fear or greed, kept back for the morrow. What they kept bred worms and stank. Others, who obeyed, found enough and were not wearied. Thus a command was enacted that bound provision to trust and Sabbath to restraint. The manna taught them in the most ordinary way to listen at dawn and to trust at dusk. Yet mercy was not measured to their moderation. When their longing turned to craving for flesh, the Lord stirred winds from the sea and piled quail about the camp in such abundance that the people went out and gathered until the hollow of their palms could hold no more. Joy at the table was quick, and with the meat came a reproof. For when appetite outran thankfulness, sickness followed. Moses lifted his hand in lament and prayer. He who had been made mediator between God and a rebellious people bore these burdens with a grief that deepened like an evening shadow. Other trials came, as fire and water. In one place the people thirsted and complained against Moses and Aaron, calling them to account. Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? Their reproach pierced him as though a spear. He cried to the Lord, and the Lord bade him take the rod and smite the rock, and water gushed forth for the multitudes. In another place, later, when the heat and weariness had sharpened his temper, Moses spoke in anger before the congregation and smote the rock twice. Water followed, yet with the work was bound a consequence. The right to enter the land he had glimpsed was withdrawn. Great leaders, it was shown, might perform wonders and yet be accounted by holiness and by the temper of their spirit. Among the people there gathered troubles of another sort, contests over authority and the shape of worship. Some, proud in their hearts, rose to arraign the way of ordination. There came a day when Korah, Dathan, and Abiram gathered men of renown and challenged the leadership, declaring that all the community were holy and that Moses and Aaron exalted themselves above the assembly. The ground drank their rebellion, the earth opened and swallowed their tents and their households, and fire consumed those who made strange incense before the Lord. Aaron too was put to test when the tribes needed a sign that the priesthood stood by the will of God. The Lord bid each man lay down his rod by the ark. In the morning Aaron's rod had budded, and almonds clung to it, an emblem of life given to a calling. Through such days the priesthood and the statutes of holiness were set in places that could be seen and touched.
Moses, who had learned the temper of God in flame, labored to teach what holiness meant in a camp of tents. He was given laws of sacrifice and of impurity, of clean and unclean, of leprosy and of childbirth, of property and of injury, of the care of the stranger and the rule of release, statutes that shaped the small things of daily life into a pattern that pointed to the divine order. The tent of meeting, the altars, the curtains woven with blue and fine linen, the garments of the priests with their bells and pomegranates, all these were made under the eye of the one who had seen the burning bush and stood in the cleft of the rock.
In these outward things, the inward covenant found form. The people were taught that the holy touches the ordinary, and that God would dwell among them when they made place for him. And still the test of the land itself pressed upon them. Moses sent men to spy the fields and cities that lay ahead, 12 princes, who walked through the land and brought back fruit heavy upon poles. The majority of the spies returned with fear in their faces. The people are strong, the cities are walled and great. We were in our own sight as grasshoppers. Only 2, faithful among them, spoke with a voice untamed by the sight of giants. Caleb said, "Let us go up at once and possess it. We are well able." Joshua stood with him and declared the faith that had borne them through the sea. But the cry of the fearful spread like a snare. The assembly lifted up its voice and wept in the night, would stone those who had counseled to go forth, and rebelled against the counsel of God. In consequence, the sentence fell. A generation that had refused to trust should wander until it was gone. Their feet would mark the parched places of the wilderness for 40 years, and the stubborn hosts would not see the good land, save for a remnant who walked in undaunted trust. War followed wandering. Amalek made sudden assault, and Joshua led the fighting men while Moses stood upon the hill with hands upraised. When his hands were lifted, Israel prevailed, but when his hands were down, even for weariness, their edge dulled. Aaron and Hur held up his arms until the sun had set and victory was complete. These scenes were not only of sword and shield, they were lessons in how prayer and persistence, the raising of hands and the steadiness of heart might turn the tide of battle. Moses, for all his ordination, was a shepherd who taught leaders to lay down burdens. At one turning, his father-in-law, who had once led a flock and had counsel for him, admonished him to set judges over thousands and hundreds, to delegate the small causes so that Moses might remain for the great and the hard. Heeding this counsel, Moses chose men of standing and fear of God, men who would judge the people with justice and lighten the daily charge upon the one who stood before the Lord. As statutes multiplied, so did the life of worship. Feasts were appointed that would mark the seasons: Passover and unleavened bread, the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Booths, times to remember deliverance, to count the growth of grain, to dwell in booths upon harvest nights. Offerings were set, burnt, sin, guilt, thank offerings, all with their appointed priests and places and meanings. Laws etched the edges of society: how one should act in the house of a neighbor, how to care for the poor and the orphan, how to restore what was taken by force. These rules were not dry commands, but cords that bound a people to a God who required both mercy and justice.
Time wore on. The camp moved from place to place, the cloud above the tabernacle going up by day and by night. Their tents were pitched, their drums of assembly beaten when order was to be kept. Children were born and buried, and the songs of one generation were taught to the next. The story of the Exodus, once a live wound, was taught as a memory that kept its sting. Yet memory is often no stronger than present longing. In the heart of the host, there were those who still envied the ease of Egypt. There were those who found faith thin as gauze when the road curved through sand and stone. Moses bore all these things: the laws he wrote, the judgments he handed down, the feasts he taught them to keep. He interceded when pestilence came in the wake of rebellion. He turned his face toward God and put himself between the people and the wrath that justice would meet. Once, when the census was taken and the tribes were arrayed by their banners, Moses assigned the duty of warfare and of service, so that each man might know his place and stand in it. He appointed Levites to carry the holy things and priests to stand before the altar. He warned that presence required purity, and purity required discipline. The years that had been measured in hope lengthened into decades. Children born in the wilderness knew nothing of the brick kilns and riverbanks of their father's bondage. For them, the desert was the only world they had trod. The Lord, who watches the heart, chose some whose faith would not fail to enter. Joshua, once a spy with Caleb, rose to be a man of war and calm. Caleb remained of spirit clear, claiming the mountain that faith had promised. Yet the one who had led them from the house of bondage bore, more and more, the sense of a work that he must finish by word, and not by coming into the fields he had seen. In the 40th year, Moses climbed the mountain that stands across the river of the plain. There he was shown the land from afar, the breadth of it, the valleys and the coast, the cities like jewels, the hills of wheat. He was allowed to see, but not to cross. His face, worn by the light he had met, reflected the weight and the sweetness of a life spent as a mediator. He called the people together in plains and in tents, and spoke to them as a father speaks to sons who must yet choose life. He rehearsed the statutes and the judgments, calling them to remember the God who had chosen them out of the clay of bondage and bound himself by oath. He warned against the seductions of idolatry, of the wealth of the nations around them, of alliances that would draw them away. His speeches were not mere instruction, but a weaving of covenant into memory. He summoned them to choose life, to love the Lord, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, that they might long maintain their portion in the soil they sought. He set before them blessings and cursings, telling plainly the fruit of obedience and the ruin that follows turning away. He reminded them of their wandering, of the manna that was broken at dawn, of the rock that poured water, of the pillar of cloud and fire that guided them. He bore witness to their stubbornness and exalted their moments of faith, always with an eye toward the generations to come. Before his departure, he commissioned Joshua and laid hands upon him. He gave final instructions to the Levites and to the princes of the tribes. The people heard a song he required them to learn, a song that would put the law into the mouth of the nation so that the memory of covenant might not fade like footings in sand. He blessed each tribe in turn with words that looked forward and down into the pattern of future days. And when these last acts were done, Moses climbed the mountain at the bidding of God, and there he gave up his spirit after a life that was both a slow consuming and a luminous gift. The people wept in the plains, and Joshua, their new leader, stood where he had been trained to stand. They mourned not only a man, but an age. The voice that had thundered became a memory to carry. But in the very mourning there was a steadiness. The law remained, the tabernacle stood, the priests served, the clouds still hovered when God chose to be near. The covenant endured, binding a people by statutes and by taste, by bread at dawn and by the memory of the sea. So the wandering closed its long circle. Many things had been tested: hunger and thirst, fear and anger, rebellion and intercession, and what remained at the end was a people no longer as they had been, taught by law and by mercy alike. The edge of holiness had been rubbed on the whetstone of necessity. Some had grown sharper, some had been ground away. Yet the promise by which God had once called Abraham from his tent held like a tether. The journey toward the land would continue under Joshua's hand, but the covenant, its statutes, its songs, its taste of manna, would travel with them, a legacy of a God who binds himself to the frail steps of his people. And the Lord was with Joshua, as he had been with Moses. The man who had been trained in the school of the aged prophet took up the mantle of leadership and set about to lead the people across the threshold that Moses had seen from afar. Joshua called the princes of the tribes and spoke unto them, saying, "Be ready, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." He bade the elders and the officers to gather the people by the banks of the river.
At his word, the priests took up the Ark of the Covenant and stood before the people, bearing the place of the Lord among them. When the feet of the priests that bear the ark were set in the brim of the waters, the Lord stopped the flow of the river. The waters that came down from above were stayed in a heap very far off, at Adam, that is, beside Zerathon. And those that came down toward the sea of the plain, even the salt sea, were cut off, and the people passed over on dry ground.
The tribes passed, men of valor and the common folk alike, the elders and the mothers bearing infants, the Levites holding the sacred things, and the whole host filed through where the bed of the river had been. The stones which the priests took up when they came out of the flood were set for a witness and a memorial among the children of Israel, that they might remember the hand of the Lord which was mighty in their behalf. Upon passing over into the land, Joshua made the people to stand in Gilgal. There, in the place of beginnings among the tents of the newly arrived, he called for the sons of Israel and circumcised the males born in the wilderness, for their fathers had been uncircumcised, and during the journey the mark of the covenant had not been kept upon them. The act was done with all reverent haste. The place where they were circumcised was called Gilgal, a rolling stone to roll away the reproach of Egypt. At Gilgal they kept the Passover in the plains, at evening on the 14th day of the month, even as the statutes required. The manna, which had been their daily bread in the wilderness, ceased the day after they ate of the old corn of the land. They ate of the fruit of the land and were satisfied, and the memory of daily bread given from heaven became a relic to be told in the years to come. Before long Joshua set his face toward Jericho, a city of strong walls and many inhabitants. He sent out men to spy secretly, and they came into a harlot's house and lodged there. The woman of Jericho hid the spies upon the roof, and brought them forth by a cord. And she said unto them, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, for the fear of you is fallen upon us. In mercy she besought them to spare her and her father's house. They swore by the Lord that their lives should be spared if she kept silence and bound the cord in her window as a sign. The Lord commanded Joshua as to the taking of the city. For 6 days the people walked about the city once, and on the 7th day they compassed it 7 times, the priests blowing with trumpets before the ark. At the sounding of the long blast, the people shouted with a great shout, and the walls fell down flat, so that the city was taken by the hand of the Lord. They devoted the city and all that therein was to destruction, as had been commanded. The silver and the gold, the vessels of brass and iron, were accursed, and to be put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Rahab and her household were spared, for she had hidden the messengers, and she dwelt among them as one who had put her trust in the God of Israel. After Jericho came the matter of Ai. At first the host sent but a small band, and they were routed. Confusion and sorrow fell upon Israel, and Joshua rent his garments and fell upon his face before the ark. The Lord revealed that there was sin among the people, that a man had taken of the devoted things and kept them in his tent.
Then Joshua knew the reproach of the Lord and sought the guilty. Achan, son of Carmi of the tribe of Judah, was discovered, and he confessed his sin. When the thing was taken out from among them, and the sin purged by due justice, Israel lifted up again its head, and went up with all the people against Ai. The men of Ai were smitten before them, and the place was made an utter desolation. In those days some of the princes of the Amorites and the Canaanite kings made war and counseled together against Israel. The Gibeonites, fearing for their lives, contrived a craft. They put old sacks upon their asses, and moldy bread, and old wineskins, and pretended that they came from a far country. They deceived the princes of Israel with their appearance, and made a league with them, for the princes asked not counsel of the Lord. When their deceit was known, the princes were wroth, yet the oath stood, for the princes had sworn by the Lord. Wherefore they could not undo it. The Gibeonites became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord. A word is to be taken of the southern and northern campaigns. The kings of the Amorites who had mustered to meet the reaping of Israel were smitten. In one great day, Joshua overthrew them at the place where the battle joined, and the Lord fought for Israel. And when 5 kings of the Amorites fled and hid themselves in a cave, they were taken and hanged, and their carcasses remained on a tree until the evening, and afterwards were cast into the cave. When the men of Gibeon were beset by a strong confederacy of northern kings, they sent to Joshua for help, saying, "Come up to us quickly." Joshua rose up and drew his men from his swift march. The Lord delivered them into his hand, and he struck them down with great slaughter. During that conflict, a marvel occurred. Joshua lifted up his eyes and said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou, moon, in the valley of Ajalon." The day was prolonged, and the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people avenged themselves upon their enemies. Thus the Lord hearkens to the voice of man whom he had chosen, and the day was written among the wonders of that time. After these victories, Joshua and the princes of Israel gathered the people to distribute the land by lot. The Lord gave rest to Israel round about, according to all that he had sworn unto their fathers. And everyone had his inheritance by the lot of their names. The Levites received no portion with their brethren in the lands of the tribes, for the Lord was their inheritance. Instead, they were given cities among the possessions of the other tribes, and certain pasture lands around the cities where their flocks might feed. Cities of refuge were appointed, that the manslayer that fled there might have shelter until judgment should be heard. The tribes took their places.
The people of Judah pitched toward the south, Ephraim and Manasseh toward the north. The children of Reuben, of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh dwelt on the east of the Jordan, toward the sunrising, as Moses had given unto them, and they bought from their brethren their part of the land. Yet they covenant to help in the wars of the Lord until the whole possession was subdued. Throughout the allotment, Joshua gave to every man his inheritance, with care and with the counsel of the princes. To Caleb, who had followed the Lord fully, he gave Hebron for an inheritance, for he had wholly followed the Lord. Cities of refuge were set on diverse sides of the Jordan, and cities for the Levites were numbered, that the patterns of law might be kept and the ministry endure. Amid these distributions, Joshua took time to rehearse what had been done. He wrote the law of the Lord in a book and laid it up for a witness among the people, that the statutes might not be forgotten in the years of ease. He charged the princes and the judges, saying, "If any man transgress the covenant of the Lord, and go and serve other gods, and worship them, the anger of the Lord shall be kindled against you. But if ye serve the Lord with a perfect heart and with a willing mind, he will be your God, and ye shall be his people." Years moved on, and the memory of wonder and of burden mingled in the ears of the living. The elders that had been with Joshua when he first went over the Jordan and had seen all the great works of the Lord waxed old and gave their counsel. Children grew who had not seen Egypt nor the sea. To them the land of promise was a possession to be tilled and to be defended. Yet the old songs of the manna, the pillar of cloud, the voice from the mount, were sung in the tents at night, and men would stop to hear the words and pass them to their children. At length Joshua called all Israel to Shechem. He assembled the elders, the heads, the judges, and officers, and set before them the law of God and the great deeds which he had wrought for them. He rehearsed the beginning, how the Lord had brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, had led them through the wilderness, and given them victory over the nations. He set before them the choice that stands before every man. Choose you this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The people answered, "The Lord our God will we serve, and his voice will we obey." Joshua made a covenant that day to the Lord, and set a great stone under the oak by the sanctuary of the Lord as a witness. He engraved the law there, and made it a place of remembrance, that when prosperity came and the heart was lifted, men might turn and see the stone and remember their covenant.
When the service of Joshua drew nigh its close, he gave his last charge, exhorting the people to be steadfast, to cleave to the law, to do justice and mercy alike, and to put away the strange gods from among them. He spoke as a man who had borne the burden, and who would soon lay it down, and the people hearkened unto him. He was old and full of days, and his eyes grew dim with the weight of years, yet his voice carried the steadiness of faith. Joshua gathered his household together and died at a good age, being old and stricken in age. And they buried him in his own inheritance at Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. The bones of Joseph, which had been brought up out of Egypt and laid in the area of their possession, rested in the portion of the children of Ephraim at Shechem, a testimony to the faithfulness of promise across generations. The elders that had seen the works of the Lord and had served with Joshua passed away in their time, and the men that followed them rose up to hold the fields and the cities. For a season Israel served the Lord. The law remained in the midst of them, and the priests ministered at the altar. But memory, as ever, is a thing that needs tending. The statutes and the songs were left as bones of a living body, to be taken up by those who would teach the children and guard the covenant against the encroachments of ease and the seductions of the neighboring peoples. Thus an age closed, with a land possessed, a law put in the mouth of the nation, and a people established under statutes and judgments. The covenant endured, and with it the call to remember, to choose, and to serve. And the story moved forward into the days when new trials and new fidelities would be proved among the sons and daughters of Israel. And it came to pass after those who had seen the works of the Lord were gone, that the people of Israel turned aside from the way which their fathers had walked. They forgot the altar stone at Shechem and the words that had been engraven on it. The high places were reared again, the wooden images and carved things were set up among the groves. And the statutes that Joshua had laid before them were lightly esteemed in the houses and in the fields. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of their enemies. Bands of raiders came upon their borders. Strong nations that dwelt round about oppressed them. Cities were taken, and the flocks were scattered. The threshing floor was defiled, and the winepress sat in silence. The voice of lamentation went up from the tents, and women beat upon timbrels and tore their garments. Yes, the remembrance of former wonders dimmed as a morning mist, and men gave themselves to their own devices. And when the people cried unto the Lord in their anguish, he remembered his covenant.
He raised up deliverers in the midst of Israel, men and women whom he set as judges to save the people from their distress. For a time the land found rest under their hand. The oppressor was broken, and the yoke was cast off, and the tribes sat in their tents and ate of the fruit of their vineyards. But when the judge was gone, the sons again turned away, and new calamity came because the old lesson had not taken root in the hearts of the young. First there arose Othniel, the son of Kenaz, who delivered Israel from the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, and the land had peace. After him there was a time of oppression by Eglon king of Moab, and Ehud, a left-handed man of Benjamin, brought deliverance by craft and by the sword. The host of Moab fell, and Israel dwelt in quiet. So was the pattern repeated. The Lord stirred up a deliverer, and the people were saved. Yet their fidelity waxed and waned as the seasons. In those days there was a prophetess in Israel, Deborah, the wife of Lapidoth. She judged Israel beneath the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people came up to her for judgment. She sent to Barak the son of Abinoam, saying, The Lord God of Israel commands thee, Take thy men and go to Mount Tabor, for I will draw unto thee Sisera, the captain of Jabin's host, by the river Kishon. Barak answered, If thou wilt go with me, I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, I will not go. Then Deborah said, I will surely go with thee. Yet there shall be no glory to thy hand in the day of that journey.
For the Lord shall sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So Barak gathered 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and they came down from the mountain. Sisera marshaled his chariots of iron and all his host, strong in his pride and in the multitude of his armor. But the Lord routed the host by a sudden overthrow. The river ran and swept the chariot wheels, and the mighty were dashed down. Sisera fled on foot and came unto the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. She set a tent pin through his temple whilst he slept, and thus the oppressor of Israel perished. Then Deborah and Barak sang together a song of triumph, recounting the deliverance and magnifying the hand of the Lord. And the land had rest 40 years. Yet the rest was not of the heart that cleaves to the Lord. Men multiplied and chose their own counsel. They took to themselves idols and practiced mercies and cruelties as their own hearts moved them. Gideon, the son of Joash of Ophrah, was called whilst he beat wheat in the winepress, hiding his work from the Midianites. An angel of the Lord appeared and said unto him, Go in this thy might, and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Gideon cast down the altar of Baal which his father had set up, and broke the idol, and called the people to repentance.
The Lord tried him by signs, and by the thinning of a host at the water, that the victory might be known to be of the Lord, and not of the sword of man. With but 300 men, by the breaking of pitchers and the blowing of trumpets and the sudden shout, Gideon smote the camp of Midian and brought deliverance. Yet in the end he made an ephod of gold that became a snare unto his house, and Israel turned aside, for the heart that has tasted deliverance may yet be led astray by substance and fame. So the judges rose up in succession, men of valor and cunning, men of weakness and of faith. Jephthah, pressed by sorrow and by oath, made a vow which brought him grievous loss when it was fulfilled. Samson, of the tribe of Dan, whose strength was a marvel, was given for a season to break the bands of the Philistines. Yet he walked carelessly with foreign women, and was taken in his pride, his eyes put out and his locks shorn. In the day of his final strength he fell upon the lords of the Philistines, and upon many who sat in their house, and so he died while smiting his foes. The narrative of these men is full of both mercy and tragedy, for the Lord worked mightily by slender instruments and by broken reeds. The tribes were divided among petty kings and strong men, and the Amorites, the Philistines, the Midianites, and others pressed upon the borders. There were times when a single act of treachery rent a tribe and caused blood to flow in the streets. Times when the mother rose against the stranger, and the stranger against the mother, because law and love had grown faint. In one grievous hour, the men of Gibeah committed a wickedness that brought war upon Benjamin. The tribes gathered as one man, and the land was smitten sore. Many perished, houses were burnt, matrons wailed in the night. Yet even in that calamity there were acts of pity and sacrifice, and the Lord's compassion was not absent. Through all these doings, the order of the tribes and the ministrations of the priesthood persisted, though often neglected. The Ark of the Covenant was taken and returned. Altars were built and overthrown. The Levites wandered as teachers and as pilgrims, seeking where truth might yet be planted. Songs of praise were composed to set before the people the marvels of the Lord, and some held fast to the covenant with a will like iron. But the common lot was to rise and fall, to be chastened and then to forget. Thus the years multiplied, and the Lord's patience was long. Many times he spared them, yet oft he allowed the scourge to come that they might learn to seek him. The memory of the pillar that led by day and the fire that went before them at night softened into tales told by mothers at the hearth. The great stone at Shechem stood, weathered by rain and the feet of men, and yet its witness was thin when the heart was hardened. And it came to pass, as the tide of days rolled onward, that the need for a more lasting rule began to be heard among the people.
The tribes looked about, seeing that neighbors had princes, and that the might of Philistia grew daily. Men cried, "Give us a king to judge us, like the nations round about us, who may go out before us and lead our hosts." But such matters belong to the time when the house of judges shall yield to the desire of the people, and the ark shall find a resting place in a city yet to be chosen. The epoch of wandering deliverance was closing. The shape of Israel's future was stirring in the hearts of men, and with it new covenants and new trials awaited the sons and daughters of Israel.